Okay, well, first of all, I think the positive aspect of 1325 is that it's a Security Council resolution, which is a pretty symbolically powerful forum within which to say something about women's place in conflict and post-conflict settings. So I think in symbolic terms, in principle, 1325 is a really powerful way to put women's different experiences of war and post-war context into the frame, into the public, into the political sphere. But of course, as great as that sounds, there are significant limitations because you can't implement such a resolution in the same kinds of ways that you can a law, or the way that you could put into practice a certain type of policy. So it's a resolution that's kind of, it's tentative in some ways. And so I think the limitations of that are that who's going to enforce that? If one of the recommendations of 1325 or one of the statements is that there should be increased number of female peacekeepers, or there should be more women in leadership and decision-making positions in peacekeeping missions, who do you hold, to that kind of commitment or to that statement? And I think that's the really difficult part. You have to hold all of the member states sort of accountable, and that's obviously quite different because member states have different priorities and commitments, of which this might be one small part of. So I think there's limitations in terms of its actual implementation and holding people responsible for implementing those. And then there's a whole host of other reasons why it's problematic. And one example that I would give is that 1325 doesn't have an inherent critique of militarization or military action. In fact, it kind of recuperates it. So in some ways, it's about recognizing women's experiences in war, or at least drawing attention to it. But on the other hand, it's not really challenging some of the root causes of war, that impact women so negatively. So it has its contradictory elements. Well, my sort of ongoing, engagement with that issue has been around the fact that I think more recently this is intensified, but there is a conflation in the media, sometimes in NGO reports, sometimes in the way in which the UN speaks about sexual exploitation and abuse. There's a conflation of a lot of different forms of violence and different practices. So, something like, child abuse in relation to IDP camps is put into the sort of same category or basket as consensual sex work, which may be highly exploitative because of the conditions, but nevertheless it's a different kind of scenario. So I think the way in which it's measured and indicated, the way it's measured and understood needs to be done in quite complex ways. Otherwise, we put together very different types of, we put together criminal acts with very problematic and exploitative conditions, but they might be non-criminal, So I think that the UN really needs to tackle some of these distinctions. I think originally it was a very broad way of understanding, so that just the term sexual exploitation and abuse is very broad, and so that's quite positive because it can capture a lot of different practices. But then it's also limiting because it means that if you're calling to account a peacekeeper who's been engaging in consensual sex with a sex worker, even if that is illegal in the local context, or even if it's forbidden in the local context, it's still a very different type of activity to, abusing children who are in a much more vulnerable state who can't give consent. So I think there are many different types of practices. So I think that the UN needs to get a little bit more sophisticated in how they understand it and then how they respond to it. And I mean, some of the responses to date have been insufficient. So the good thing is there's lots of reporting happening and lots of expose, which is a really positive sign about SEA. You don't want to have peacekeeping missions where there's no cases, because that indicates that, not that it's not happening, but it indicates that people don't feel safe reporting. So in fact, missions should have reports, should have cases on the books, and then do things to respond to those appropriately. And I think just kind of endless training is not really going to change what is essentially a structural and systemic problem of gender inequalities and racial and class inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities. So they really need quite sophisticated sort of research to inform the kind of responses, I think. And to date, I don't think the UN has really taken the urgency of that on board. So that's what I think is holding back the UN from really tackling this issue.